And from that upright posture, just noticing that the bones will carry the weight of the body so that the muscles can soften and widen and relax. And particularly softening the area around the chest, around the ribs, allowing the breath to breathe the body. And now bringing to mind an image that reminds you of compassion. Some image where suffering or harm is being met, is being tended to. Perhaps it's comforting someone who's in pain, mental or physical pain. Or perhaps you're inspired by Guan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion, the face we put on compassion. Just bringing that image to mind. And compassion has that sense of uplifting the mind, uplifting the heart. And so you might begin to notice whether you feel that. You feel some pleasant sensation in the body or in the mind because of this image. Maybe it brings a smile or some kind of warm feeling in the belly. Just observing whether there's a pleasant feeling associated with that image of compassion. And where you feel it, how you feel it. And if you don't find the feeling in your body or the pleasant feeling in the mind, that's okay. It's enough just to contemplate the presence of compassion, of the image of compassion. But if you do find that pleasant feeling, then you can begin to gather it together in your heart center. You can begin to gather that feeling. Sometimes I like to put my hand right there in my heart center and feel the gathering of compassion. So using the inhalation as a way to help gather that pleasant feeling together, as if you were stoking a fire or a light there. So with the inhalation, you're brightening that feeling, that light of compassion, right there in your heart center. Brightening on the in-breath, that light of compassion growing right there in your heart center. Returning to the image. If you lose the feeling of it, that's fine. Just going back to the image. And then finding again the feeling in the body and gathering it toward the heart center by using the in-breath to bring it, to strengthen it. No need to worry about whether it's big or it's small. It's immeasurable. Just brightening with each in-breath. That light of compassion. And as that light of compassion is growing brighter with the in-breath, then also naturally it's flowing outward in all directions on the out-breath. So brightening the light of compassion on the in-breath and letting it flow on the out-breath. Still brightening that light on the in-breath and flowing on the out-breath. That light of compassion flowing boundlessly in front of you. Unobstructed. Passing through all things without harm. And extending the light so that it flows boundlessly to the right of you. No need to strain or push. The light just flows naturally. And then flowing boundlessly behind you. That light flowing with each out-breath. And extending further, flowing out to the left of you, boundlessly. The light of compassion flowing. And now that light of compassion flowing up through your body and above you, limitlessly. The light flowing upward. And flowing down through your body and below you, boundlessly flowing, the light of compassion. Just letting that light of compassion get brighter and brighter, filling the space around you and through you. And in these last few minutes of the meditation, knowing that you are also receiving the compassion of many people around the world who are doing this very practice right now. So the light of compassion also being filled up by others who are extending it to you. Wonderful. So now we will take about a 5-minute stretch break. You can stand up and stretch your legs or just adjust your posture, because we're going to be seated again for about another hour and a half after this. So just taking a moment to take care of the body. Okay, so if you're standing, you can go ahead and get seated again for the Dhamma talk. So I'd like to start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. I think that everyone here is aware that there is suffering. Suffering in the world, suffering in ourselves. I think we all know that. We all see that. Right? We can see it every day on our computers, on the television, in the books we read, or on the phone, right? That's why it's called doom scrolling. And we can see it in ourselves, we can see it in our bodies, in our hearts and minds. And while most of us have a tendency to fall to one side or another of that equation, awareness of the suffering so-called external to us or the suffering internally, we know about it. We know something about it. And so the question before us as practitioners is, what's a skillful response to that? How do we offer a wholesome response to that? And time and again, what we see in the teachings of early Buddhism, what we see in the Dhamma of early Buddhism is the call to compassion. Right? I think the simplest way of defining compassion is that. It's the intention that beings be free from harm, be free from suffering. That they be safe, that they be out of harm's way. And yet, that's not always what happens, right? When we see suffering. Sometimes we see suffering and we get angry. Or we see suffering and we get overwhelmed by sadness, as was mentioned already here earlier today. Or just numbed out to it. Right? Maybe this has happened to you. That you've been surprised, perhaps, by your response to seeing certain kinds of suffering. And the Buddha, when he talks about this, he talks about starting with empathy. Right? Just as I am averse to pain, just as I don't want to die, just as I don't want to suffer, so too other beings are averse to pain. They don't want to suffer. So we can begin with empathy. But interestingly, that beginning requires us to have seen our own suffering with a certain degree of compassion as well, right? To have acknowledged in our own hearts that aversion to suffering or that desire to be free of it. So we have to look inward. And then we can relate what we see inward to what we see outwardly as well. When I was doing some training, some spiritual care in the hospital as a chaplain, there was a gentleman who was on the floor for people with chronic disease. And that was one of the more difficult places in the hospital because people would come through again and again, kind of knowing that their situation was not going to get resolved anytime soon. And there was this gentleman who was there, and he was yelling at everyone, like really, really yelling very harshly at literally everyone. He was in a room with a roommate, and his roommate had put up the curtain between them, and still he would yell through the curtain at this person in the other bed, and he would yell at the staff out the door. He was confined to the bed, and just scream, very angry and using a lot of very harsh, very nasty language. And it was really straining people's capacity to deal with him, to just even understand him at all or provide care for him, because it was just a constant stream of this kind of harsh speech. And so I was his chaplain and had to think a little bit about how to approach this situation. And I was thinking a little bit, just even trying to understand what it was that was driving him. And I realized that because his neighbor had put up the curtain between them, and he was in the bed closer to the door so that the staff could hear him and kind of respond to his very shouted requests, then he was basically shut out of any kind of natural setting. Right? He didn't have any access to any windows. He was in this very small, kind of confined part of the room. And I thought, well, I don't know about him, but for me, it helps a lot to be able to look out the window and see nature. And that would be perhaps calming a little bit. And so I talked to the nurse and kind of convinced her that we'd try to get him over to the window, not the window in his room because of what was going on with the other person in his room, but another big, a very large window at the end of the hallway over by where the elevators were. And so she went through the trouble of getting him in the wheelchair and everything, this very large, very loud man screaming. And we wheeled him over to the window, and he got really quiet. And we just stood there quietly for what seemed like a long time, given how he had been behaving. And then he started to say something, and we sort of braced ourselves, the nurse and I, we looked at each other, and we braced ourselves for him to, let loose another set of swear words. And he said, "I never noticed that the sky is so blue. I never noticed that the sky is so blue." And so we stood there and we talked about how blue the sky was for a little while. And then eventually he had to go back to his room. But it was a beautiful moment, and the nurse came later on and said, "Wow, I didn't think about what was his experience of being in the room and how that was driving this behavior that was so difficult." So it was a moment of seeing that the empathy for what was happening for him could lead to another way of dealing with what was a very difficult situation. And so that's a place to start, certainly, for us to try to develop empathy, to think about meeting folks with an understanding of the fact that they are experiencing some kind of suffering. But a mundane empathy, I will add, a mundane empathy doesn't resolve the problem of suffering. Right? Otherwise, we wouldn't need the Dhamma. The Dhamma goes beyond that kind of simple empathy to a much further, much more penetrative kind of understanding. Because eventually the man does have to go back to his room, and he, even though they gave him a window space, eventually, some of that behavior did continue. So we have to go further, and we go further, and the Buddha talks about this in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, right? In the very first discourse, he talks about, he exhorts us, encourages us to try to understand suffering. To really work at cultivating an understanding of suffering, or of dukkha in general. So I'm using suffering as a shorthand, and obviously dukkha is a much larger experience, it's a broader category than that. It is, we could say, probably closer to kind of unsatisfactoriness and all the possible shades of that. But we need to go further in this understanding of how it is that suffering and harm comes to be in the world, right? Suffering and pain and harm. And for this reason, I believe we have the two kinds of compassion that are described in the suttas. So some of you may know that karuna is one way. Karuna is one way one Pali word that we translate as compassion, and the other word is anukampa. Anukampa, yeah. And these two ways of understanding compassion are related, of course, but I would say significantly different, and lead us to some different ways of thinking about how to actually cultivate compassion within ourselves. So karuna is the type of compassion that we just did in the meditation there, the one that was mentioned in that excerpt from the sutta that I shared earlier, karuna as a Brahmavihara. And it is really, it's filling the mind, the citta, so mind, heart, with joy, with brightness, with this very spacious, very open feeling, and a kind of clarity, right? Because the Brahmaviharas are also not just known for being pleasant states of abiding, but also states that lead directly to the jhanas. It can be doors into very, very deep, clear states of meditation. Right? And that's true because they have the tendency of kind of crowding out the hindrances, right? So that's why it's without ill will. Without hostility and without ill will, that last line of the paragraph that we saw earlier. Because it's filling the mind with this wholesome state, pervading the mind with a wholesome state. And inclining the mind, so the more we do this practice, the more that the mind inclines toward this wholesomeness, this capacity for compassion becomes cultivated, becomes more developed. And it nourishes us. So one of the things, and so I'm now trying to show you how these states, these ideas are interrelated, right? So the clarity of the mind is aided by this type of practice of compassion. And it also provides us with a kind of nourishment, a kind of a strength and energy that helps us to have courage to meet the kind of suffering and harm that we see in the world, right? Because that's not always easy, as I said earlier. So there's a legend about Kuan Yin Bodhisattva, also known as Avalokitesvara in the Sanskrit, other early Indian language from that period of time. And Avalokitesvara, or also known as Kanon or Kanzeon in Japan, also known as Chenrezig in Tibetan. So this being that represents compassion, it's said that they, because Avalokitesvara is sometimes known as male and sometimes female and sometimes kind of more neutral, or even as animals, other kinds of beings, but the name means the hearer of the cries or the sounds of the world, and that's one way to parse it. And the legend goes that Avalokitesvara would hear the cries of the world and their head would split. And this happened 9 times. And then finally the Buddha, seeing this, gave Avalokitesvara a head that wouldn't split. So sometimes you see statues of this bodhisattva called the 10-face Kanon, or the 10-face Avalokitesvara. A tale that sort of points at the amount of courage and stability of mind that we need to bring to our practice of compassion. But doing this, cultivating this compassion in this way, through the Brahmaviharas, it's a way to, the way I understand it is, we take a sort of mundane example of compassion or a mundane feeling or thought about compassion, and using our intention and using the breath, we turn it into something which is universal, a universal kind of compassion that can be limitless, that can be flowing in all directions, that doesn't depend on our ability necessarily to relate individually to specific people who need our compassion, but is a more general way of inclining the mind toward compassion. And actually, in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the numbered discourses, there's a lovely sutta in which the Buddha says that doing this kind of practice also can bring an end to one's own thoughts of harming others. So if you struggle with these kinds of ideas of harm, of causing harm, this is a practice that will also address that by kind of retuning the mind. So this is a way of changing the world from the inside out, if you will. We have the intention to lessen suffering and harm, and we begin here in our inner world, brightening and clarifying and strengthening that. And then everything that we interact with benefits from that, either directly or indirectly. And then we have anukampa. So anukampa is the other form, the other Pali word that we see associated with compassion. And we see this in the suttas, and it's the active kind of compassion. So So compassion that is actually visible in our actions and in our speech. So it's said, for example, that when the Buddha got up off the seat of enlightenment and decided to begin to teach, that was an act of anukampa, that was his compassion. And in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, and the sutta describing the Buddha's death, the events that led up to that, and shortly after that, the Buddha also gives this teaching. He says, take these practices, these knowledges that I've shared with you, and remember them, and practice them, and develop them, and cultivate them as an act of compassion for the world. Do that in compassion, out of compassion for the world. So sharing the Dhamma, practicing the Dhamma, is itself also an act of compassion. Perhaps the most effective act of compassion, because it will get to the root causes. Ultimately, it will get to the root causes of dukkha, of suffering and harm. And also the precepts. Practicing the precepts is another way, it's another form of anukampa. In fact, again, that way of relating to others. There's a beautiful sutta in which the Buddha goes through the 5 precepts and says exactly that, right? I don't want to be killed, and certainly others then therefore also don't want to be killed, so why would I do that to them? I would instead practice the first precept of not killing beings, living beings. It said putting down the rod, right, and being compassionate toward the world. And this is a kind of compassion that also gives others a way to trust, to enter into relationship with you. Practicing the precepts can build a tremendous amount of trust and confidence. And it's also, this anukampa, I would say, is also the teaching which is the basis for our social actions, our activity in the world to help bring others to more freedom, more justice. I'm also reminded, so for example, what we do at Buddhist Global Relief is definitely directly anukampa, right? We are providing an opportunity for folks to be involved, to put their resources and their efforts toward lessening the oppression of young women and girls, for example, or people who are impoverished, or taking care of folks who are hungry, who are going through the physical and mental suffering associated with hunger. There's a beautiful sutta in which the Buddha is, he's going to give a teaching, and as is described in many suttas, he knows that there's one particular person who will benefit the most that day, whose mind is most prepared for that teaching of that day, and they can awaken or achieve one of the 4 stages of awakening that day. And unfortunately, that person, their cow got loose. And so they spent the morning, or the afternoon actually, I think it was the time was after the meal, and the monastics are sitting there and they've invited the Buddha to give the talk, and the Buddha's not giving the talk. And it's because the person that is most going to benefit that day, their cow got loose, and so they're chasing around after their cow. And this takes hours apparently for this person to corral the cow, and finally they get the cow put away in the barn or tied down or whatever it is that they were doing with their cow. I don't know, I haven't never tended cows myself. So. But in any event, this person finally does show up to the assembly. And rather than have them sit down and immediately start giving the talk, the Buddha very compassionately says, this person was running after their cow the whole day and hasn't had anything to eat. So please give them something to eat, because they won't be able to take in the teaching until they've had some food. And so the whole assembly of monastics and lay people, whoever else is there waiting for this talk, they all have to wait for this person to eat. But that was the Buddha's compassion, that this person who is going to benefit from this teaching wouldn't be able to hear it unless they had the opportunity to alleviate their hunger. So similarly, we know that there are folks in the world who need to alleviate their hunger if they're going to be able to do anything else well. They're going to be able to participate with their families, their communities, in society. And that's part of what we're doing with BGR, right? And we do it in this way, and you're going to hear this video in a few moments, but we do it in this beautiful way of coming and working with folks, local organizations. Not saying from 5,000 miles away that we know the best way for you to do this, but rather that we want to support you who know how to do this intimately. So anukampa is the other form, the second form of compassion, actually. So karuna in terms of thoughts, beneficial thoughts, and anukampa in terms of beneficial speech and action. And then given these teachings, then I believe that what does happen is that we do find that we have the strength to meet some part of the suffering and the dukkha and the harm that we see in the world. We find that the Dhamma gives us the nourishment that we need and the clarity to be courageous and step up to the suffering that we see in ourselves and in the world. Thank you. Great, so we have a bit of time for some questions or comments or other kinds of sharing before the video at the end. So if folks want to, as we said earlier today, if you want to ask a question, you can go to the reactions tab on your menu there, and you should have a place where it says raise hand. And you can raise your hand, or you can also try putting it in the chat if you can't find your raise hand. And I'm happy to respond to questions. Hi, David Purcell. Yes, would you like to unmute yourself? Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dalinda. So when you were speaking about the first sutta, you recommended it for people who are struggling with harming others. I feel sometimes it crossed my mind that, but more inward focused. So I wonder if you could say more about that and that's
Yes. So yes, so the sutta, let me give you the reference here because I just happen to have it written down. The sutta in particular is the Nisaraniya Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya, or Numbered Discourses 6.13, from the Book of Sixes, the number 13, in case that's helpful to you. If you have access to that, you can look it up online also. And yes, so basically, all of the Brahmaviharas, but the compassion, the karuna in particular, is very directly sort of inclining the mind away from hostility, right? It's a way of kind of sort of repeatedly filling the mind with a state which is the opposite of what causes the desire to cause harm, right? So anger, ill will, these are the states that tend to drive causing harm to other people. So the practice of karuna is basically over and over again bringing to mind this very positive, pleasant state and this intention toward having compassion. And the more that we do that, so we know both in terms of like physically, there are little grooves that get created in our mind from our habit patterns, but also we know that karmically, what we do with intention tends to create future results. So when we bring this intention to have compassion, then that creates more of a tendency in the mind to go in that direction in response, instead of going in the direction of wanting to lash out. Bhante, did you want to add anything to that? No? Okay. I hope that's helpful, David. So, somebody put in the chat, would we write the word? So let me just write the word for you in the chat, and I'll spell it as I'm saying it out loud here. So it's the second word. So the first word is, this is karuna. That's the meditation that we did. And anukampa is the sort of active form of compassion. Diane, yes, I see that you have your hand up. You're still muted.
Thank you very much.
Okay, yes.
When you mentioned sending compassion out of the left side of your body, is that because the heart is sort of more to the left of your body? I had never heard that before.
Oh, no, Diane, so just to clarify, what I was doing was trying to give you the prompt that you see in the instructions. So it says, I'm pervading 1/4 of the world, and then the second quarter, and then the third quarter, and then the fourth quarter. So I do that by telling you first to the front, and then extending to the side, and then extending to the back, and then extending to the left side, so that eventually and then above and below, right? So it's just basically echoing what's in the instructions in the sutta, but giving you the sort of physical prompt so that you can imagine that way that the light of the compassion or the energy of the compassion can be spreading in all the directions. Does that make sense? Oh, I lost Diane. I can't see her now. All right. Jane Rosbro. I hope Rosebro. I'm sorry, I'm not sure about the pronunciation there. So please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Ayya.
Yes.
I've not heard the word Anukampa before. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because that's a very precise picture of it. I'm sorry about the echo. I don't know what's
That's okay.
happening with the echo.
That's
Sorry.
okay. Yes. Just to say a little bit more about the word, yeah. So as I said, with the way that we see it used, to my knowledge, in the Pali Suttas, is that it's an active form of compassion, and oftentimes specifically associated with teaching the Dhamma, sharing the Dhamma, practicing the Dhamma, practicing the precepts. All of these things are described as anukampa. And so rather than the meditative form of compassion, it's a kind of compassion that directly meets in action and in speech, directly meets the root of the suffering and harm that we see. So again, examples are the Buddha deciding to teach, or the Buddha exhorting others to practice and to continue teaching as he was dying, and this way of, for example, upholding the first precept of not killing living beings. It says, out of compassion, showing compassion for them. That word that we're translating as compassion is this Pali word, anukampa. Okay, so there's a little bit of an echo when people are asking questions, so maybe I will mute my mic when you're asking the questions, and that way we can hear them better. There was one question in the chat, and then I will come back to you in just a second, Belinda, because I see that you have your hand up. So, oh, sorry, hold on. So Dayani says, good evening. One of the right livelihood is not to do animal slaughtering business. Does purchasing the meat against the path? Could you comment? Thanks. Yeah. So this is a matter of much discussion, I would say, among different Buddhist communities. And yes, it's true that slaughtering animals is described as not right livelihood, as far as I know. Purchasing the meat, I mean, you could say that you are creating a demand for that, in a sense. But if the being, for example, I can say this, for the monastic community, for example, if somebody kills a being specifically to feed us, we can't eat it. That's considered unacceptable. But if that's what they're already eating, right? And it hasn't been killed specifically for us, but that is their sustenance, then the Buddha said the monastics could accept it, and should actually accept it if it were offered. So I suppose that you have to discern for yourself whether you feel that by purchasing the meat, you are driving the reason for that or not. Right? I think that if you look across Buddhist communities, there are all different ways of handling this question. There are monastics who eat all sorts of meat and get offered all sorts of meat, and they are okay with that. That's the practice that they have taken on. I myself trained at a monastery in Japan, which was in a fishing village. And so we received a lot of fish and a lot of shellfish and a lot of different kinds of seafood. And that was what people had to offer. And we never turned any of that stuff away. And on the other hand, you also see other communities where they're vegan. They're completely vegan. They don't need even honey because of being kind to the bees. So that would be my response. I don't know if there are other monastics here who would like to reply to this. The reverends or Bhante?
What you said about the whoops.
Yes, I can hear you.
But there's an echo. Maybe the echo is coming from my
maybe
computer.
turned off your mic.
Okay, now I could speak without the echo. Okay. Yeah, what you said is correct according to the early Buddhist tradition. Like the Buddha said for the monastics, there are 3 conditions under which they cannot accept meat, which really comes out to the same thing. Whether if they see an animal being killed for them, hear that an animal has been killed for them, or have some suspicion that the animal is killed for him, then they can't accept that meat. And we see in the suttas, in fact, the Buddha himself accepts offerings of meat. And so I think if the purchasing of meat was to be prohibited, he would have prohibited the lay people even from purchasing meat, but he doesn't do that. But in later Buddhist tradition, especially through the influence of several of the Mahayana sutras, a passage in the Lankavatara Sutra and the Shurangama Sutra, then meat eating is condemned and rejected. And so, at least in the monastic strains of East Asian Buddhism in China, Korea, and Vietnam, then meat eating is prohibited at the monasteries. But I assume that the lay people, the lay Chinese Buddhists, lay Vietnamese, Korean Buddhists, unless they're very devout, will purchase meat from the market, though not kill the animal. Well, actually, some maybe will kill the animals themselves if they're fishing, like fishermen. And in Tibet, because there's not traditionally much vegetation growing in Tibet, so I know that the Tibetan monks would eat meat. Yeah,
But
so that's...
Maybe it's chime in coming from a tradition that's pretty strongly vegetarian. So as Bhikkhu Bodhi said, there's a number of Mahayana sutras, and particularly in the precepts that the monastics take in this tradition that actually kind of prohibit eating meat. So so monasteries were pretty strongly vegetarian, and then kind of our lay community is kind of vegetarian and is part of the practice of thus not harming. But I think it's just, as we just was explained, it's kind of held slightly differently in different traditions with different principles. I think what Venerables just discussed was there's a principle of accepting whatever offerings people give, because the monastics don't, cook for themselves, purchase food or for offerings, and so there's a sense of not being a burden.
And you can support the heart of generosity.
Yeah, for people's care. But at the same time, if there is the option, for us, we're very blessed here. The lay people bring vegetarian offerings.
Thank you, Venerables, for sharing. Bhante and the reverence, thank you. Belinda, so you've been patiently waiting. Thank you for that. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, or say what you want to say?
My question is on the Karuna meditation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hearing echo.
Okay, wait, I'm going to mute.
Thank you. So my question is, at the Karuna meditation, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the pleasant feeling that you mentioned, because, for example, the image I bring up usually is an injured or hungry animal, and my wish to care for that animal. So at that point of that image, my feeling is more of a concern, a little sadness, and wanting to help, and not so much what I would typically describe as pleasant or joyful. Perhaps after I've helped them, I would feel that. But at that point of generating that wanting to help mindset is more kind of that concerning feeling. So when you're guiding us through the pleasant feeling, I wasn't quite connecting that feeling at that point. So maybe it's just a definition of the term, but I would like to hear a little bit more explanation. Thank you.
No, I think it's good to bring this up because I think that this is one of the places where people can have difficulty or get tripped up with this particular meditation, right? The metta is a little bit easier because you're thinking about kindness or you're thinking about loving, or there's a kind of built-in automatic sort of, for some, sense of the pleasantness of it. And so so what I would recommend for you is to think about to go to the place of helping that being or having helped that being or whatever place it is that brings up the pleasant for you. Because the Brahmaviharas must be pleasant by definition. If it's unpleasant, then you're not in the Brahmavihara yet. So it's a pleasant abide. That's why it's a Brahma Vihara, right? It's a divine, wonderful, delicious place to hang out. So you can come up. You need to come up with an image. And some folks don't use an image. Some folks can just key off of a word, as I said earlier, or off, for example, like the face of Kuan Yin, or something that someone said to them. Any of those things are all fine, but something that evokes the kind of pleasant feeling of meeting the suffering. You can't really generate the pleasantness of the karuna if it's suffering that's going unmet. So it has to be to some degree met in order for that pleasant feeling to come up. So for example, what I think of when I'm thinking about something like that, like a stray kitten in the street or something that needs help, then I would think about like the actual helping happening. Sometimes you could see like a video of that on YouTube or whatever, for whatever reason it happens to come across my YouTube all the time, is those different metta and karuna. What I feel like are metta and karuna, videos. It's like, oh yes, here's meeting this suffering of this being, and then look how happy they are at the end, and their little tail is wagging. That's the part where, right, you can feel the positive sensation of it, and so that's the part to focus on. Great. Yes, thank you for the question. And then I'm just going to go back here to the chat for a little bit, and. So there's one that says, I seek some advice as to skillful means. When I see suffering in the world, I feel a lot of pain sometimes. It feels so overwhelming. And I think sometimes I switched off and have no feelings one way or the other. Yes, so this is also a danger, right? Is that feeling of overwhelm or that feeling of drowning in so much suffering that's happening in the world, or a feeling of becoming numb or just unable to respond. In the healthcare, I talked a little bit about doing spiritual care in healthcare settings. It's sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue, So people go into these helping professions with the idea with wonderful ideas of compassion, and then they get tired. They just literally get tired and can't bring that empathetic response. So two things I want to say about that. One is, I think it's very important to be aware of our own limits when it comes to seeing and acknowledging dukkha. It does no good to try to force yourself beyond your own capacity to address it. That's actually just another source of dukkha, right? Like trying to force oneself or getting beyond what you can do. So maybe that means, and we sometimes refer to this as like guarding the senses. Maybe that means that you limit the amount of news that you watch, or the amount of, so-called doom scrolling like social media, or you stop getting the newspaper for a while, or you only read the comics, or I used to always read the comics first, because then I felt like that gave me enough of a positive frame of mind that I could then read the other things in the paper. So that's one thing, is to try to tune into your own, where your limit is, and not go beyond that if you can, right? Don't force yourself. The other thing I would say is, again, my personal experience is that practicing the Brahmaviharas has so nourished and strengthened and steadied this heart, mind, that my capacity is different now, is greater now. So I really, really encourage you to practice the Brahmaviharas, and all four of them are, if the overwhelm is very strong, then maybe like mudita, and put some emphasis on mudita and upekkha, on the empathetic joy, right? So you want to bring joy into your life and in a positive way, so resonating positively with other folks' wholesome joy. That's what mudita means, to be more specific. And that can help, again, to kind of ease some of the pain and be a place where you can help the mind. And then equanimity, so upekkha, the way that I think of equanimity, and I might talk about this a little bit tomorrow when I'm talking about clarity, is that it's a mind that is so vast, so spacious, that whatever arises there doesn't throw you off balance. It's able to contain or be with a much greater range, let's say, without this push-pull or being thrown off balance or being overwhelmed. So that's a long way of saying I try practicing the Brahmaviharas a bit more as a way of addressing, and try not to take yourself beyond that state. Not going into the state of overwhelm, then definitely I would recommend, some so-called withdrawal or seclusion from those kinds of suffering that you find overwhelming. Okay, so back to hand up. Shyamali, you could go ahead and unmute. Okay, and let me mute myself so that we don't get...
Thank you, Ayya Dhammadipa. Thank you very much for your session. It's very useful. I just want to express my feeling about karuna and anukampa. In the Dhamma, karuna is actually discussed much more, because that is feeling for the other person's pain. But when it comes to anukampa, because there is the word says anukampa, there is a certain amount of disturbance, like that you can sometimes feel sad about it, whether that is the difference. Some people kind of feel like a tiny bit of trauma or something because of the other person's suffering. So I think much more appropriate is karuna. Anukampa is also connected. What are your thoughts on that, Ayya Dhammadipa? Thank you very much.
Yes, so as I understand it, I think that these two concepts are related. And what I was trying to show was some of the examples where we see this word anukampa being used. And so just to use again the example of, not killing living beings as being a form of compassion toward them. So it doesn't imply necessarily that you're upset about that. It's actually refraining from an activity that you know is going to create harm and suffering in the world. So there's probably a range of ways that it's being used, and they are definitely related. But I think, again, that the emphasis that I was wanting to make is more, or the distinction that I was wanting to make is more that karuna is something that is very, as I've seen it in the suttas, and perhaps Bhante has some other thoughts about this, but is it an inner practice that's happening? It's in terms of our inner thought world that we are developing compassion there. And anukampa is seen much more in an active mode. It's a response. So it's a not doing something or a doing something which we know for the specific reason of not causing harm and suffering in the world. So.
But there is some kind of disturbance, right? Yeah.
Well, so the question of disturbance, right? It is very possible, yes, that we have a sense of being moved by the suffering of the world. That's important. That's important in order to generate the anukampa. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Ayya.
Yeah, but
Appreciate it.
yeah, we find anukampa is used in describing the Buddha and the Arahant disciples. So they don't have any disturbance, but it's, as Ayya said, it's being, anukampa is the way in which compassion motivates one, or moves one to do something to alleviate the suffering or the ignorance of others. So I just did a little search. Just the thing is, with the internet, you could just find all of the textual passages that use a particular word. So we have in this sutta, Mahasunyata Sutta, it says that the teacher, that's the Buddha, teaches the Dhamma to his disciples, anukampang upadaya, out of compassion for them.
Okay.
Yeah. So, compassion, anukampa, doesn't necessarily mean that one is disturbed or troubled in the mind, but it means that the heart is shaking with the suffering of others, or resonating with the suffering of others,
Right.
in a way that motivates you to do something to alleviate their suffering.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yes.
It cost you too much trouble having to research it. But
No, it's okay, Shamali. It's okay. It's good. I just think it's very important for us not to get the idea that compassion has to hurt.
Right, exactly.
Because it's not the case.
Yes.
I don't think that that's true.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante, yes, for the quick research there. Yeah, and the comments, of course. Yes, so going on, let's see, there's another question. My biggest obstacle to compassion is consistent focus on self. I get so subsumed by my own suffering and preoccupations that I don't think outwardly to generate compassion towards suffering. What practices could I do to help lessen this self-focus and think outwardly? Yes, so this is a little bit of what I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk. So most of us have a tendency to be more aware of suffering or difficulty in the external world, or to be more aware of suffering or difficulty in the inner world, in the internal world. Most of us have a tendency to lean very strongly one way or the other, and to become more balanced about that, or to be able to see more of it, is where we work on this empathetic response. So my experience is oftentimes that when there's not an ability to generate compassion for what's happening externally, it's because there hasn't been a compassion for what's happening internally yet. So when you say you get subsumed by your own suffering, I take that to mean this word subsumed, like overwhelmed, or like it becomes very too much. And so there are many different ways to think about it. I mean, again, generating wholesome mind states, so that's one way of addressing it. Trying to generate wholesome mind states when you are feeling a lot of pain. That can be a way of sort of giving yourself enough space to come back to it, because you can't really eliminate the unwholesome mind states by having wholesome mind states on top of them, if you know what I mean. You have to eventually be able to come back to it. The other thing is to begin to see very clearly, and this takes a little bit of practice over time, though I find that it's quite effective, to see clearly the harm that you're causing to yourself if you become overwhelmed, or if you allow yourself to become to like drown in certain feelings. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you can investigate, so turn, when that starts to happen, you start to feel like you're totally caught up in your own suffering and you can't even relate to what's going on in the world. If you can investigate and maybe use a framework, like, for example, the framework of the 5 khandhas, you can have a look. What's happening in the body right now? Okay, what's happening here in the body at this moment? And ground yourself in that physical experience, trying not to have a reaction to your reaction, right? So maybe you see in the body that there's tears happening, or that there's a contraction in the heart, or that your jaw is clenched. If you can observe those things, right, without adding a bunch of judgment about whether it should or should not be there, but simply observing the presence of those things, and giving yourself that gift of patience, of just looking at it and grounding yourself in it. Then you can move to the mental, and you can look at the mental. Oh, okay, so what's happening now? It's unpleasant. It's quite unpleasant, right? This is an unpleasant Vedana, unpleasant sensation. And what happens, that unpleasant sensation is associated with this perception, whatever perception it was, some thought, some image you saw of, something from a movie disturbed you, or some photo you saw, something somebody said to you. You go ahead and just look at it in terms of what was the feeling tone, what's the perception, right? What's the story that goes with it? That's the sankhara. There's a story that went with it, that was this reaction that built up around it, right? When did it become conscious? You unpack the the thing with a little bit of investigation, again with as little judgment as possible. And if you can do that repeatedly, then what you're doing is you're also training the mind to a lesser reactivity, to be able to see those things happen, or see that particular activity or that particular physical response or that particular mental unpleasantness, and not add a second arrow, not add a bunch of reactivity and judgment on top of it. So I hope that that helps. And let's see. So Shamali, we have the video coming up here soon, but we have time for one more brief question if you have another question. Or did you still just have your hand up from before? Okay.
Wait. Yes, actually, not before. I have a comment actually, Ayya. The comment is that if you feel traumatized by something, then you're not having enough compassion for yourself. And I'm wondering whether in the Karuna meditation, they say to have metta to yourself first is to avoid things like that. Because that way you're having, you're loving yourself first kind of thing. I mean, a lot of these psychologists have written about those, this kind of thing. And I'm wondering whether if you don't love yourself, how can you love other people? Meaning that if you don't have compassion for yourself, and if you're putting all that trauma on yourself, then that is not loving. If you have any comments, please let us know. But thank you very much.
Yes. So I don't think that it's helpful to blame or judge ourselves if we are experiencing trauma. Whether it means that we're not loving ourselves enough or anything like that, I don't think that that's a helpful response. I think that if people have experienced trauma, that the results of historical actions are echoing in them. That's what's happening there, and it comes up again, and it gets connected with moments, things that are contacts in the current moment. So I would go back to the thought that one way to deal with it, to the extent that you can, moderating without overwhelming the self, is to conduct this kind of very sort of detailed investigation, but starting with grounding in the body as much as possible, unless, again, it's a trauma related to the body. And then you have to sort of ground yourself in an external object, like sometimes looking at a tree or hearing sounds, music, something that will calm the system enough to allow you to observe what's happening. That said, loving kindness, always a good idea, always. All right, and then somebody else gave the question, can the process that I described work for grief as well? And I would say yes. Again, grief is, particularly now with the pandemic, and there's been so much loss of people, loss of independence, loss of connection, loss of jobs, loss of many, many, many things. There can be also beautiful things that come out of it, like more Dhamma online. But grief is something that I think we could definitely, as a society, stand to learn a little bit more about. And yes, and using this process of investigation for grief, which can come in these huge, overwhelming waves, you can steady yourself. You can steady yourself by doing this kind of practice with time. It takes a lot of experience and a lot of patience And again, a very, very clear discernment about when it's enough, when you need to step away, when you need to just distract or step out a little bit, because you can't really push the process. Grief also is a process which has its own intelligence and its own time frame, and we don't do well by trying to make it fit a preconceived time frame. That's usually a recipe for actually having more grief or more trouble from the grief. So, all right, very good questions today. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciated all that and the interaction. And I think that Patricia or Yvonne, we are ready to move on to our video then.
Thank you, Ayya, for these beautiful teachings on compassion. To end this session, we'd like to share a short introductory video on the work of BGR. This video was made for us by one of the many wonderful volunteers who contribute their time, their energy, and their compassionate action to our work. Please feel free to adjust the volume on your computer if you need to. And Kim will start the video. Thank you.
We are Buddhist Global Relief, and our mission is to combat chronic hunger and malnutrition in poor communities around the world. We empower people to rise above the conditions which drive them down. We give direct food aid to those whose immediate survival may be threatened by hunger and malnutrition. We facilitate sustainable farming programs for small farmers to provide for themselves. Supporting girls and women is a proven element in any successful fight to reverse poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. And so we promote the education and vocational training of girls and women around the globe, giving them new opportunities to provide for themselves and their families. Enriching the lives of women can start whole communities on the path out of poverty. Nearly 91% of BGR's expenditures go directly to supporting our approximately 40 projects around the world and here in the US. We work with partners large and small, such as Action Against Hunger, Lotus Outreach International, and the Bodhicitta Foundation. In Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Buddhist Global Relief provides 800 hot meals a day for children, many of whom walk several miles to receive their only meal for the day. In Bangladesh, BGR provides meals for 128 girls in elementary and middle schools. These meals not only improve the health and nutrition of the girls, but also greatly improve their ability to study and learn. Because of these nutritional benefits, the dropout rate in these schools is declining. Students tend to stay in school because they are well fed and, in fact, stay in school longer. As a result of this, the number of children who continue on to secondary school is also increasing. With this increased education comes even more opportunity for these children. In Cambodia, one project provides much-needed rice. This allows the girls to stay in school rather than be forced to drop out to accept unsuitable work due to the pressure to support their families. This project even helps some of the young women to attend university. In fact, some of these young women have moved back to their home villages after graduation to work as school teachers and continued the beneficial cycle of growth and support. Another project provides scholarships for refugee children in Thailand, whose parents work as backpack medics in the conflict zones of Myanmar. In many countries, our projects help improve food security by teaching sustainable methods of small-scale farming. Sustainable small-scale farming improves accessibility to food, quality of diets, crop yields, and household incomes. It also decreases dependence on external aid over time. In one farming-based support program, our partner in Kenya works with farmers to replant indigenous crops and trees. This project provides improved nutrition and incomes for participating families. In India, another farming project helps women develop resilient farming practices to enable them to adapt to a changing climate. Here in the US, our partner in Detroit teaches communities how to grow their own food and supports them as they develop urban gardens. As a result of these farming projects, thousands of rural and urban folks now have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, which provide nutrients needed to combat the incidence of chronic problems like heart disease and diabetes, which plague many vulnerable communities. Aside from giving direct food support and facilitating farming programs, BGR provides vocational training to women and girls. Vocational training is an effective way to improve the well-being of families around the globe. BGR supports a center in Cameroon which provides vocational training to single mothers as well as to the many women widowed as a result of frequent regional conflicts. In Sri Lanka, we support young women as they receive technical school and university-level training, which gives them the opportunity to build better lives. In Punjab, India, we help provide training and marketing skills to women, many of whom were widowed, leaving them with no source of income. And in Nagpur, India, we support a girls' home which implements many of our methods in one place. We provide housing, scholarships, nutrition, job training, and other necessary assistance to 30 young women. For close to 1 billion people around the world, hunger is a terrible and ever-present reality. It hounds their every step. According to the World Food Program, each year 6 million people, many of them children, die of hunger and hunger-related diseases. Building pathways out of this devastating circumstance is possible. Your donation to Buddhist Global Relief will give people affected by hunger the support they need to pull themselves out of this condition and lead lives of dignity, purpose, and strength. You can use the link below to give and give generously. We are Buddhist Global Relief, and we thank you deeply for your support.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope that this video has given you some sense of the impact of our work. We're heading into a break now. We'll resume the retreat for an evening session at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific. 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thank you.